So welcome to Tuesday Evenings with Fola. Thank you for joining us. This is the third in the series of talks about people collectively and actively engaging with holding on to green space for public access in the 1920s and 30s. So we heard what was happening with the Open Space Society, focusing on battles with access and ancient trees and advertising signs and things through their lantern slide collection held at Merle. And last week with the LCC being encouraged with the might of the local neighbourhood to take over an abandoned spa watering hole that would have been gobbled up by a developer, and how it has a small part of this garden, and how as a small part of this garden has not been restored, but taken into a sympathetic and newish future. And now we'll hear about another contemporary organisation, the Cpre, a collection which is also held at the Merle. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Francesca Church. So following her first degree in computer science and then a master's in rural estate management, she got hooked onto environmental research and went on to do a collections-based doctorate at the University of Reading, focusing on the Cpre archive. And her PhD was Cultures of Amenity, the Council for the Preservation of Rural England, 1926 to 1950. So who better, we thought, to talk about the early years of the Cpre. So Francesca, thank you very much for joining us, and have fun.
Thank you. Oh, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, I'm quite excited to sort of chat with you all afterwards as well. I was going to say that I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts as much as questions, and sort of talk a little bit in the presentation about some of the overlaps with the ILA, but I'd love to hear more from your points of view as well, to sort of see what you think. So this talk will look at the early preservationist movement and the need for collaborative action that led to the creation of the Cpre in 1926. We'll explore the Cpre's structure, its key individuals, the Council's approach to preservationism, the significance of being an umbrella organisation, and the importance of amenity. Drawing on ideas that were important to both the ILA and the Cpre in the first half of the 20th century, we'll explore two examples of these overlaps, focusing on education, in particular the Cpre's exhibitions, as well as roadside planting. And then the concept of amenity is woven throughout this talk, as it was through the work of the Cpre, as a key part of the Council's founding aims, and an idea around which much of their practices, approaches, and identity were based. And as you mentioned, this talk is based on research undertaken at the Museum of English Rural Life in Reading, which I'm sure many of you know, and it focuses heavily on their archive, the Cpre's archive held there. Oh, here we go. Oh, there. So amongst one of the most significant responses to the increased urbanisation and industrialisation of the 19th and early 20th centuries was the founding of Preservationist Societies dedicated to preserving a range of features of the landscape, including scenery, buildings and wildlife. Some of the more prominent organisations prior to the First World War included the Commons Preservation Society, you've got the Selborne League, Society for the Protection of Birds, National Trust. There's a big long list here as well. And this movement began to develop a strong communality of interest. Indeed, at the turn of the century, there were a number of suggestions for a national body to coordinate the countryside protection campaign. Patrick Abercrombie, planner and co-founder of the Cpre, documented that the Scapa Society had attempted to coordinate the work of these different bodies, broadly covering concerted action in defence of the picturesque and romantic elements in our national life by drawing together a number of voluntary organisations, and the House of Commons Amenities Committee at a conference in 1898. Now, the grouped voluntary organisations were never formally given a name, and the Parliamentary Amenities Committee was not particularly effective. However, the most significant legacy of this drive towards concerted action was in providing the model and the framework for the creation of the Cpre in 1926, as well as their Scottish and Welsh counterparts in 1927 and 28. So in a book entitled The Preservation of Rural England, later described as the Cpre's founding manifesto, Patrick Abercrombie praised this early focus on coordination and argued that this work only requires carrying on and reinforcing today to forward the idea of the creation of a network of organisations throughout the country to form the base of a great amenities party. Such a joint committee could be comprised of representatives from the coordinated societies with local contacts, established either through existing bodies or through special rural preservation societies that might come into existence. These ideas would filter into the formation of the Cpre structure through its constituent and affiliated societies and in the creation of local branches throughout the country. We'll look a little bit more at that in a second. But as you might have noticed, the word amenity has cropped up a number of times already, and we'll discuss that more as we go along. But it's important to note here the centrality of amenity to the Cpre's founding objectives, aiming firstly to organise concerted action to secure the protection of rural scenery and of the amenities of country towns and villages from disfigurement or injury. Secondly, to act either directly or through its constituent and affiliated members as a centre for furnishing or procuring advice and information upon any matters affecting the protection of such amenities. And thirdly, to arouse, form and educate public opinion in order to ensure the promotion of the objects of the council. So on Tuesday, 2nd of March, 1926, a conference of representatives of societies interested in the preservation of rural England was convened by Guy Dauber, the then president of the Royal Institute of British Architects. Many of the attendees were already highly distinguished, decorated or influential within their field. Certainly a letter of support from the then Minister of Health, Neville Chamberlain, was read out by the Secretary that highlighted the Minister's support in their endeavour to awaken public opinion to the importance of preserving rural amenities. And it was from this initial meeting that the idea of a joint council was taken up, leading to the creation of the Cpre on the 20th of April that same year. So the Cpre were created as an umbrella group that would bring together these like-minded societies. Importantly, the Cpre stressed that it would not supersede nor override any of the bodies which had combined to form it. Instead, the organisation would aim to to assist the whole of its constituent members by bringing to their aid in time of need the force and influence of every organisation interested in the protection of amenities from different points of view. So as you can see on the slide, this diagram shows the structure of the original Cpre. So you've got the affiliated societies who worked with the Cpre on sort of specific projects on specific matters. Then you've got the constituent societies, such as National Trust, REBA, Scapa Society, AA, etc. And they were more closely entwined with the Cpre and in the sort of day-to-day sort of running and decisions of the Cpre. And then in you've got the sort of dotted line box, you have the committees and branches that were set up by the Cpre. So overseeing the whole organisation is the National Office in London, which is where the Executive Committee were based and where the organisation's secretary worked. Also at the national level were subcommittees, and these were created to work on specific projects and issues. And then lastly, you have the local branches that were set up largely along county lines. And with this structure, the council sought a national coverage of the rural landscape, coordinating the efforts of groups concerned with all matters of amenity, for example, architecture, planning, landowning, agriculture, leisure, local government, wildlife, the list goes on. So in any discussion of the Cpre, it'd be difficult not to mention certain individuals. So I thought it might include a few photographs of some of the key individuals who were instrumental in the Cpre's early work. I don't know, I always think it quite nice to sort of see who you're talking about as much as anything else. And I'm sure that, their names will crop up throughout this talk. And I'm sure that many of you as well know the names, if not the faces of many of them. So on this slide, we've got Patrick Abercrombie, John Dower and Guy Dauber, who I think we've already mentioned. CEM Jode, Clough Williams Ellis, they were both quite instrumental in sort of writing quite a lot about the CPRE and about the cause, and contributed a lot to sort of different articles and book chapters and things like that that sort of kind of push their ideas forward and the preservationist movement forward. Vaughan Cornish, again, you know, almost a household name, perhaps, I don't know. Leslie Scott, Dudley Stamp, Thomas Sharp, all part of the Cpre's executive committee in its formative years. And there are certainly overlaps with the ILA and the Cpre's membership, particularly in the 1940s with individuals such as H.G. Holford, Patrick Abercrombie, Clough Williams-Ellis, Dudley Stamp and Thomas Sharp, as we mentioned. And then on this slide, we have Lord Crawford, who is president of the Cpre, and H.G. Griffin, the Cpre secretary, sorry, for many years, and two quite, large and important figures in the Cpre's history. But as well as focusing on the roles that many of these individuals held within and then out with the Cpre, it's particularly important and interesting to note the ways in which they conducted their work. John Vincent, editor of a volume of Lord Crawford's diary from 1892 to 1940, provides an insightful summary on the nexus of quiet politics, public duty, and elitism. He writes, Lord Crawford's sudden death on the 8th of March 1940 marked the close of a life of which the keynote was perhaps doing good by stealth, or at least outside the public gaze. He touched history at many points. He moved easily among the greats of his time. Yet, despite his remarkable range of achievements and interest, he neither sought nor received much public attention. Indeed, the council's early approach in particular was characterized by quaint politeness. Hall describes the early Cpre's approach, depicting its representatives padding persuasively down the corridors of power, making a representation here, dropping a note of regret there, listening with attention to the minister. In addition, the calmness with which the Cpre approached preservationism is emphasized, that they made some visible progress, but scarcely engendering an order of excitement or enthusiasm commensurate with the problems which had called it into being. And this quiet and often tactful collegiality that came to define the Cpre's approach to preservationism was picked up on by the Times in an article on the first 10 years of the Cpre. The record of the Cpre shows that it has got the hand of the situation and knows that the word amenity can be applied to the conduct of affairs as well as the country which the council was founded to preserve. Amenity then could be seen to be as much about approach as it was about preservationism. In particular here, I should also mention that H.G. Griffin, the Cpre secretary, who was instrumental in the daily running of the organisation, coordinating responses with constituent societies, navigating disagreements, pushing forward the Cpre's work. And yet Griffin has been described as restrained, valuing personal connections, preferring to do good by stealth and be found out by accident, and disliking strong arm tactics. In addition, he has been described as a man who always shunned any loud actions. In a quiet, indefatigable, yet purposeful manner, he pursued the realization of his plans, arguably a continuation of the Victorian ideals that linked private behaviour and public duty. Indeed, Griffin had successfully tried by elucidation and education to plant respect and appreciation for nature and the idea of preserving beautiful scenery in wide circles. And so it's to this focus on education that we'll now turn. Of course, in a focus on education, we can see great parallels with the work of the ILA, who in 1933 published their first educational syllabus, seeing a need for high-end, high-quality education and the importance of knowledge sharing amongst its members. Brenda Colvin, writing in 1979, described the Institute's early ideas regarding education. In those early years, we only had the faintest notion of how the Institute might develop or how the work and influence of the profession could expand through joint effort. We were concerned with the need for communication and the sharing of information among members. We felt the need for better means of education and more public recognition than was available. Certainly, educational links can be clearly seen at a university level, with Edward Prentice Mawson becoming president of the ILA in 1933, H.F. Clarke appointed as a sessional lecturer in landscape design at the University of Reading in 1942. And landscape courses started at Regent Street Polytechnic under Brenda Colvin in 1943 as some early examples. Moreover, wartime publications of the Journal of the ILA advocated for the wider involvement of landscape architects in public discussions and projects such as new towns, developing what we now call sort of brownfield land, protection of agricultural land, forestry, issues of urban sprawl, and the design of roads and roadsides, to which we will return later. And one of the key educational approaches that I'm particularly interested in are exhibitions. Thinking, for example, about 1939 exhibition held at the RIBA, which offered an opportunity for landscape professionals to demonstrate the importance of landscape architecture in public projects and discourse, as well as the important landscape architecture exhibitions as part of the Festival of Britain in 1951. Exhibitions were certainly a huge part of the CPRE's approach to education in the interwar period. The CPRE employed the use of two types of exhibitions, the planning conference exhibition and the travelling exhibition. The CPRE's Save the Countryside display, organised by Harry Peach, was a hybrid of these two types, beginning as a single exhibition displayed alongside a conference that then expanded into multiple displays and subsequently travelled throughout the country. So this first exhibition was initially displayed at University College Leicester alongside the National Countryside Conference held in the city in 1928. A written, though unattributed, account of the exhibition included in the CPRE's archive file on the conference describes the embodied experience of the delegates as they approached the exhibition, walked through the grounds into the building, and then from one display to another. The spatiality of the CPRE's exhibitions created an embodied experience that was designed to create a lasting impression through a process of exploration and discovery in which the visitor's body movements, sensory experiences, associations, recollections, and imaginations contribute to the overall effect beyond what is explicitly presented and expressed. Recounting the setting and approach to the display, the write-up of the exhibition detailed, as one entered the quiet and restful gardens which surrounded the pleasant university building, two large hoardings on the lawns shouted at one. These consisted of the usual enamelled petrol and cigarette signs with their hard, brutal colouring, and how incongruous they seemed here. Over each was this written: "You don't like these here, why do you have them on the streets and countryside?" And these scenarios can be seen as an example of exhibitions that at this time comprised more than just rooms for sort of traditional pictorial display. And this assemblage of practices made for ever richer resources, such as dioramas or even sort of life-size models. Continuing along the path towards the exhibition, the written account describes the exhibition entrance and its decoration. Entering the doors, a finely written panel of verse decorated with the countryside symbol of oak, ash, and thorn gave 3 verses from Kipling. In this verse, linking aesthetics and labour, Kipling returned to his old ideal of action as the paramount virtue. Here, the CPRE argued that amenity did not merely require admiration, it demanded action. This was a keynote of the whole conference, and as such, this quote was included on the cover of the conference and the exhibition programme. The exhibition boards themselves were hung up on the wall on the perimeter of the room. The panels displayed an arrangement of photographs, architect designs, satirical cartoons, reproductions of paintings and portraits. And the majority of the panels portray rural amenity as the CPRE understood it. Positive displays of good planning examples, often of local character, beautiful scenery, worked landscapes, and well-designed signs, buildings, and advertisements. So it was not an appeal through extensively worded arguments that was put forward by the CPRE, but examples provided through specific places and landscapes. The amenity evidenced by such photographs would be both the topic of education and the means of education. The demand for and publicity surrounding the exhibition led to 4 separate displays being created to be available for loan to responsible groups anxious to help the movement. As well as tailoring the exhibition to specific occasions, the CPRE wanted them to be relevant to the places in which they were shown. And Peach maintained that the exhibition should be organised in such a way that it could be continually added to. So the council suggested, where possible, a small collection of local examples be collected and shown as well. Indeed, the original exhibition in Leicester included illustrations from the county, reflecting the importance of regionality at this time. Oh, sorry. So in this last, or the second half of this talk, I'd like to explore this regionality a little more by looking at the CPRE's Lancashire branch in the first half of the 20th century. The Lancashire branch of the Cpre held its inaugural meeting on the 7th of July 1933 at the County Hall, Preston, and was presided over by Lord Derby. The meeting was attended by the president of the National Cpre, Lord Crawford, as well as mayors, councillors, officials and distinguished Lancashire men and women from all parts of the county. In the bringing together of these individuals, Lord Derby commented that probably never before has a more representative body of Lancashire opinion been called together in this hall. In addition to those present, the branch's 1933-34 annual report records that support for the movement was contained in hundreds of communications sent to Sir George Etherton, clerk to the County Council, who had been responsible for the arrangements for the meeting. Letters were received from national figures such as Sir Hilton Young, then Minister of Health, Sir Kingsley Wood, Postmaster General, Oliver Stanley, Minister of Transport, the First Commissioner of Works, and also the Minister of Agriculture. A formal resolution was proposed to form this new Lancashire branch and was carried unanimously, with the branch's boundaries mapped to the same as the county. On the 14th of December 1933, a meeting of the General Council of the branch was held at the county offices in Preston, where the constitution and rules of the branch were decided upon. The aims and objectives of the branch reflected that of the National Cpre, as tended to be most of the local branches. And they focused on the preservation of amenity through collaborative efforts and education. Among its initial priorities in preparation for the future was the recruitment of members and donations. And it was decided there would be two distinct forms of membership. So the first included local authorities and organisations, and the second with individual members, both subject to the approval of the branch's executive committee. And the branch actually received substantial support from the County Council, who supplied their office space at the County Hall, as well as giving large annual donations to the Cpre branch. Philip A. Barnes was appointed as the branch's secretary in July 1935, taking over from H.G. Griffin, the Cpre's national secretary, who had filled the role until a full-time secretary could be supported for the branch. Though Griffin continued as honorary secretary of the branch. In the 1920s, the young draftsman Barnes had been an activist in the Sheffield Clarion Ramblers and became involved in the mass trespass at Kinderscout in 1932. A fellow campaigner for access to the countryside, Tom Stevenson, described Barnes as a dedicated Sheffield Rambler and persistent trespasser. Some academics have noted that these working men were the chief campaigners for access to the forbidden moors, and yet the legend of mass trespass in 1932 has it that the early rambling clubs consisted of middle-aged, middle-class, easily cowed people who achieved nothing. This, of course, has implications for the understanding of the Cpre's own history and challenges somewhat the previous homogenised depictions of the council as elitist and authoritarian. Indeed, some academics have described the council as an obscurantist body which defines an aesthetic born of an elite country house society, and both the Cpre and its sister organisation in Wales as elitist bodies whose membership essentially comprised urban professionals and country gentlefolk. So whilst it must be acknowledged that the Cpre's members are both national and local sort of branch level, well, they did include establishment figures, but this has formally been used as a generalisation that masks the involvement of a variety of members, the different forms of knowledge that contributed to the Cpre's work, as well as the council's priorities and motivations. It has been argued that though the Cpre quickly established county branches, it was predominantly a metropolitan-centred movement, comprising a small but influential group of intellectuals, members of the artistic and literary establishments, and the landed aristocracy. However, again, this homogenisation of the Cpre's members and influences serves to mask the varied nature of the council, the impact of the local branches, and the work undertaken at and between local and national scales. So as such, I found it particularly interesting to follow the work of Phil Barnes, sort of working class secretary for the branch throughout my research. Now, the Lancashire Cpre's branch chairman, W.F. Ashcroft, praised Barnes for his qualifications as a lecturer, organiser and skilled photographer. And we can see here an example of his cartography skills. And there are numerous lantern slides in the archives at Merle, which are fantastic, and I could go on about them for a while. But similarly to the national CPRE, the Lancashire branch also viewed education as paramount and were prolific in producing these sorts of educational materials. So the lantern slides with accompanying lectures, exhibitions, pamphlets, materials for schools and universities, and they had stands at numerous agricultural shows. Sorry. And the branch had similar approach to the ILA at this time, wanting to both work with the public as well as industry professionals. And as such, they produced books and pamphlets of use to builders and architects with recommendations of building materials and prices. Now, I could probably go on for quite a while about the Lancashire branch, as they achieved quite a lot in their first couple of decades. But I thought it'd be interesting to pick up on some ways in which the branch had similarities with the ILA and how their sort of work crossed over and into overlapped. So I mentioned earlier, briefly, the ILA's interest in roadside planting, and this was a topic that the Lancashire branch was particularly focused on in the 1940s. At this time, there was another society called the Roads Beautifying Association, who perceived themselves to be the progressive modern creators of new patterns and styles in the English countryside, whilst they viewed the Cpre as preservers of historic local scenery as it is/was. Indeed, this tension between the two organisations had started in the mid-1930s when the Cpre created a trunk roads joint committee, comprising a number of CPRE members and other constituent societies. Though the RBA had been included on this committee, they wrote to the CPRE arguing that the issues under consideration by the committee were ones already being addressed by the RBA, and maintained that there was no reason for stealing our thunder. To which Griffin, the CPRE secretary, responded that the CPRE had been discussing these issues long before the RBA had been formed. In the late 1940s, these tensions arose again in discussions around roadside planting, concerning the types of plants chosen and their placement within the landscape. Barnes argued that the CPRE were getting tied up too closely with the RBA once more. He wrote, "We disagree fundamentally on roadside planting, and I think it far better to stick to our principles and ally ourselves with organisations which more or less agree with us, the ILA, for example," and asked Griffin to stand up to the RBA on the issues debated. Griffin attempted to provide some reassurance to Barnes in noting that this tension was felt similarly by the RBA, who were apprehensive in the opposite direction. Though for Griffin, this was not necessarily a negative point, as he argued that between us, we shall probably achieve a fairly balanced solution. Indeed, as we've previously seen, Griffin prized cooperation and joint action that resulted from a reasonable and well-meaning attitude and amenity of approach. Nevertheless, Barnes felt that the national CPRE could be firmer in their stance, arguing that the CPRE were being rather feeble. And you see this sort of extract here from a letter in which he was quite annoyed about the whole thing. But the Lancashire branch were emphasising that this was not just an issue of cordial relationships between societies. This was related to an understanding of amenity that determined which types of plants should be planted and used and how, where relational geography of amenity governs the type of plants that should be used and the ways in which they should harmonise with the landscape, not only to suit the particular local character or provide natural irregularities, but also to ensure that the plants just survived in particular localities and regions. The branch advised that the trees will certainly be needed in some places, and elsewhere, large masses of the common native shrubs should be planted: thorns, hazels, brooms, gorse, briars, etc. shrubs which have proved by their persistence in the neighbourhood by their capacity for standing up to Lancashire's climate with the minimum of attention. The ornamental and exotic shrubs advocated by the RBA were out of place in the countryside. Thus, the branch argued for planting that was in keeping with the character of the landscape through which the road passes. This rejection of ornamentation and beautification, as is often called, in the countryside was not only endorsed by the national Cpre, but was reflected in the work of Brenda Colvin. So as well as being a founding member of the ILA, Colvin was also the Institute's representative on the Cpre's Committee on Roads and Landscaping between 1949 and 54. Colvin, in a 1939 publication, argued against the prevailing British obsession of beautifying roads, maintaining that, unfortunately, most of the planting that's been done still shows a misunderstanding of the principles involved and an almost pathetic lack of vision. The logic of much of it seems to be based on the assumption that since flowering trees and shrubs are pretty and excite our admiration, the more of these and the greater the number of varieties we plant along the roads, the more the roads will be beautified. The RBA argued that they were continuing the work of several generations of enlightened landowners and gardeners who had brought horticultural variety to the English landscape. Yet Colvin argued that this approach was an issue on roads where motor cars would be travelling at faster speeds, commenting that travelling at anything over 30 miles an hour, the details of flowers and leaf count very little. Form and mass, light and shadow are the materials we must make use of. And these are also the requirements for the point of view of the more distant observer in the countryside. Indeed, the ILA viewed ornamental plants as too detailed, small scale and distracting, threatening to fragment or disrupt the desired feeling of streamlined speed. Small ornamental plants were more suited to a setting in which they would be passed at a walking pace, but would be lost in a blur when travelling at speed in the car. These issues of road travel, speed and planting, influenced by an understanding of amenity as experiential and inhabited, were also discussed by the Lancashire branch in the 1930s, stating that however good in detail a planting scheme may be, if it's continued without a break or change, the effect soon becomes monotonous. Furthermore, the motorist travelling quickly along such roads sees the broad effect of colour and massing rather than the detailed charm of individual shrubs or trees. Large masses of one shade of colour and isolated clumps of shrubs or trees are therefore considered more effective than mixing them. Both the branch and the ILA were also interested in how roadside planting could improve safety, guide the attention of motorists, screen unsightly views, prevent boredom, reduce dazzle and enliven the scene. In relation to this, the branch also noted that the design of bridges could help in keeping the attention of motorists, as in an hour, a motorist will pass under many of these bridges, and if they're all alike, the effect will be monotonous, even if there is a standard, even if the standard is a good one. Moreover, the driver's embodied experience of travelling along the roads and their engagement with the landscape scenery could be improved through ensuring better road safety. The enjoyment of the countryside by the traveller is not only achieved through the beauty and interest of the surroundings. Roads must be safe and easy for both motorists and cyclists, or they will suffer mental strain and have very little thought for scenery. On a crowded main road, the cyclist cannot feel secure and free from anxiety on his relatively frail and unstable machine. His presence is certainly one of the main sources of anxiety and strain to the motorist, especially at night. Indeed, Colvin and later Sylvia Crone, Jellicoe, positioned the mobile gaze of the driver at the core of their work and writing on the landscaping of roads. And it's particularly interesting to see how the Cpre and here the Lancashire branch were influenced by their understanding of amenity to consider an embodied engagement with road and landscape. That amenity was not only to be sort of viewed and enjoyed, but to be experienced and inhabited. So on that note, I thought I might summarise some of the things we've been looking at this evening, sort of beginning with the origins of the Preservationist movement, the need for collaborative action between these varied Preservationist societies. We explored the structure of the Cpre as an umbrella group, the place of the constituent societies within the Cpre, and some of the individuals that often overlapped with the ILA. importantly, we explored the ways in which these individuals worked, the importance of quiet and tactful collegiality in the CPRE's approach to preservationism, enabling the CPRE to work as an umbrella group, and furthering the Council's objective of concerted action. We then looked at some of the ways in which the ILA and CPRE had similar aims, looking at education, particular exhibitions, as well as the discussions around roadside planting, particularly looking at the CPRE's Lancashire branch in the first half of the 20th century, and the influence of their secretary, Phil Barnes. And here we sort of touched upon, briefly on prevailing arguments that the CPRE was an elitist organisation, and talked about how this can often hide the work of other individuals and branches, the sort of local work being undertaken by the CPRE. And intertwined throughout this whole talk has been the notion of amenity, which was certainly an important concept for the CPRE at the time. For the council, amenity was not just about scenery, but an inhabited and experienced landscape. It was not to be admired from afar, but demanded action and concerted action to protect the rural amenity that they loved so dearly. In persuading others to join this cause, amenity was mobilised as a key concept that was not just the topic of education, but the method of education as well. But in sort of talking, through this and from my research, you sort of realise how many things there are, how much research there is left to be done. Looking at perhaps how amenity was conceptualised and used by other organisations at this time, and how it was sort of mobilised, how it was defined. But amenity is still part, is a large part of our planning discussions, and how we sort of talk about landscape. How do we define it nowadays? What is the sort of progression of ideas about how we use amenity, and how it's sort of leveraged sometimes as well. Indeed, I had a look when I was doing this preparing for this talk. I had a look on the CPRE, well, the current CPRE's website. It's now, it's changed name a number of times, but it's now the CPRE, the countryside charity. And one of their sort of, they've got an area that says, well, what do we believe in? What do we stand for? And one of them is, we believe that landscape is more than just the view. It's the ever-changing relationship between people, place, and nature. And in essence, this is very similar to the way in which the early CPRE conceptualized amenity as a relational concept that concerned an embodied and experienced landscape. And, as I'm sure that, many of you sort of see as well, that these same issues sort of come up again and again, sort of there's similar discussions being had by the CPRE a century later. The early CPRE talked about a duty to the future, and that's a similar way in which we currently talk about climate change discussions. Amenity is used in the early CPRE amenity is sort of talked about with distinctive character, about sort of place, about thriving landscapes that are worked and embodied, and that there are communities. And these are things that we're still, talking about, that we're still discussing, that are still important. So these sort of ideas about who gets to enjoy amenity and how, and these link into ideas about access to certain landscapes, things like that. So these are still ideas that are hugely important, and it's interesting sort of picking up on the CPRE sort of early definitions, and perhaps thinking about how we might use them, perhaps, or sort of see how they sort of developed. So I think, yes, I've sort of ended perhaps on more questions than perhaps I've answered. I don't know, but I would love to hear your thoughts, and hopefully I can answer any questions. I don't know.
Francesca, thank you so much for that, and also well done for coping with that miserable cold. I thought you did magnificently.
I made it. I can't believe it.
But I before I open the question debate, I would just like to say exactly what you ended on, what an extraordinary microcosm of the whole landscape-oriented world the CPRE has been, and the study of it will seem to raise every issue, every debate, every tricky point that philosophical, social, that we've ever debated, and I think that is extraordinarily fascinating. There's a question to start us off from Annabelle, which was also one I was pondering. Is the CPRE still an umbrella group, and what happened to the early organisations that came under that umbrella?
No, it's no longer an umbrella group, although I know they do work closely with other organisations, but I think certainly in a very different way. Yeah, they still have the local branches. So that's still a huge part of how the CPRE work, but it's just the constituents and societies have essentially broken away. So you have like the National Trust and things like that. There are some which have sort of faded and are no longer around, but there are some key ones. So you've got RIBA, you've got the ILA, you've got National Trust, some really large household names that have just kind of gone their own way. But yes, the CPRE still has local branches. I think it still covers the whole sort of countryside, and it still has sort of sister organisations in Wales and in Scotland as well, although they're sort of called something slightly different. And yeah, I'm not an expert on how much they interact, so I wouldn't be able to say on that. But yeah, hopefully that sort of answers it a bit.
And Annabelle follows that up with a very pertinent question. Can you say why there is no, sorry, my chapter's just vanished down the screen. There is none of this history on the CPRE website, because it's absolutely gripping and very informative. Write it?
That's an interesting question. It really is. Yes, you'd probably expect it more on the website. They released a book. Was it a couple of years ago now? Oh, probably 3 or 4, if not more. I can't remember. It's a few years ago. Called 22 Reasons to Save the Countryside, or something like that. And it's a fascinating book. And it does talk about their history, but through sort of specific issues. So sort of interwoven through, which is lovely. And Oliver Hilliam, who works for the CPRE, he was one of the sort of co-authors, and he knows an incredible amount about the CPRE. So it was quite interesting. I worked a bit with him on some of the CPRE research as well. So yeah, it's interesting. They sort of do have an awareness of their own history, but I wonder perhaps sometimes if that awareness is quite local sometimes as well. So the local branches will have an idea of what they've done, but perhaps not as a national body, perhaps sometimes, and perhaps how they link up with other counties. I don't know. I mean, we sort of held an event. I did sort of an event bringing lots of the local branches together when I was in the middle of my PhD, and it was fascinating because I sort of thought, oh, we'll get all the archive materials out and we'll get everyone to have a little look and see what they think, and they might learn something they didn't know, and it might be useful for them to sort of perhaps think, oh, well, this issue is still going on and they were talking about it 50 years ago and here it is in the archive, and that sort of thing. And yet, there's me thinking that, and actually loads of the attendants brought in, pamphlets that, had been printed. They'd brought in newspaper clippings. They were like, oh, have you seen this? Come and have a look at this. And so, far be it for me to sort of tell them about their history. They sort of had an idea of it themselves. So whether it needs sort of perhaps bringing together in some way, I don't know, but there is so much, and they have had so much of an influence that it seems quite crazy to me sometimes that it's sort of tucked away a little bit. So I don't know. It's an interesting one, I think.
I think I feel a book coming on for you, Francesca. Camilla asked, have you researched Thomas Sharp? I thought he sounded very interesting as well. I'm interested to know more about him.
I'm afraid not. No, he's one of the sort of characters that kind of comes in and out of the CPRE's history. He sort of, I think, sat on the executive committee, and sort of, you'll see some letters and a few little bits here and there, but I can't say I know a huge amount about him specifically. I sort of focused on a few of the key kind of individuals, and I mean, a lot about sort of H.G. Griffin. He's a wonderful individual to learn about, and his sort of approach to the CPRE's work, and write some wonderful letters, and a few of the local characters as well. So Phil Barnes and Ethel Haythornthwaite, who I think is becoming more of a sort of household name as well. She was a Sheffield and Peak District. I think she was the secretary for their branch, and she did a lot of work during the war, actually, for the national Cpre. And the Sheffield branch, I've been revisiting a lot of her work lately, actually, and they've created this app which you can basically go around the Peak District. I think they've named different mountains and hills after her, basically, and you can sort of tick them off as you go along, which is quite nice. So yeah, it's nice that there's these individuals that kind of are being brought out a little bit more to sort of talk about their contributions. But no, I'm afraid not. I'm not an expert on Thomas Sharp, I'm afraid. Sorry. That's a rather hopeless answer.
Not. Thank you for that. Virginia, are you there? I'm going to be very idle and ask you to perhaps voice your 2 comments and a question. If you are there and would like to unmute.
Yes, I am here. Yeah, I mean, being both a member of the Landscape Institute and the Cpre, I'm just really wondering about their relationship today. And the comment on the quote on the screen about landscape being not just the view seemed to me to echo what landscape architects actually, how they actually approach analysing a landscape with LV, landscape visual assessments. So it isn't just the view. I've actually missed out the word view there. So does anybody have a view on the relationship between these 2 organisations today?
I wouldn't like to say personally. I'm not sure what the interaction would be today. Hopefully, perhaps someone else might have an idea of, I don't know, if they've sort of worked with anyone from the Cpre. I mean, yeah, I don't know.
And I wondered whether you'd come across the publication in Indignation, published in 2000.
Yes.
You know that well, do you?
Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah, I've got a copy of that, and no, I anything like that. I love that sort of thing. And I think as well about this sort of, particularly the early Cpres, they sort of didn't mince their words, and I think that's important. I think the passion behind so much of it, and sort of chatting about the Cpre is this very staid sort of organisation that seems sort of polite and kind of able to sort of talk to people in power and things like that. But actually, when you read some of the articles and some of their work, that sort of the way they talk about their sort of their passion for the landscape, for the preservationist cause. And there's a really wonderful I think it's in a survey book, and I think it's Clough Williams Ellis was asked to write a preface to this book. So there around the interwar sort of time, there were lots of surveys being made of different counties and things like that. And yeah, so he was asked to write a preface to one of them, and he sort of talks about how I've been asked to write something yet again, essentially, and will it do any good? It doesn't seem to have done any good. And essentially it was almost a eulogy for the countryside and for their work. And he was saying that generations from now will blame their feckless parents, basically, for squandering this beauty and this wonderful landscape that that he lived in. And yeah, that sort of that passion and that sadness sometimes, I think, is quite powerful. I think, as much as the Cpre have been described and sometimes are seen as this very, I don't know, polite and very proper sort of organisation, I think sometimes it's good to see, I think, that other side, that real sort of passion and that real and indignation does have that sort of, I don't know. Yeah, I thought it was a wonderful. Yeah, I've quoted that in my thesis quite a lot as well. So yeah.
Thanks, Francesca. I hesitate to intrude my own thoughts, but Virginia, you were asking about the relationship with the CPRE and the LI, and I think a lot of people would say, well, the CPRE is a pressure group, the LI is a professional body, or I can feel Brodie beginning to draw breath. Is the LI also a pressure group? Are we both? Well, I throw that one open in case anyone wants to. Brodie, do you want to come back now and comment on that, or would you like to have time to think about that one? Brodie obviously is the president-elect of the Landscape Institute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good question, and I don't actually know the answer to the current relationship between CPRE and the LI, but I do know that we've had internal debates about whether we're a campaigning organisation or merely just a sort of membership body that happens to be a charity. And my view is we're not always the best body to campaign, but there are certain issues we should campaign about, and there lies the potential overlap with the Countryside Charity, the CPRE, and so I think there's room for greater cooperation and collaboration. And I'd like to. I'm listening in because I'd like to know more how the CPRE has kind of modernized and redefined its relationship with the landscape. So, because it seems that the word preservation is much misinterpreted. So I'd like to know, has the CPRE kind of modernized its view of accepting change and the fact that preservation is misunderstood, and the word amenity is much misunderstood as well? If you could answer that one.
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, you've raised some really important sort of points. I think, yeah, preservationism and sort of the word just preservation, I think, sort of seemed to be a little bit sort of weight on the CPRE, sort of not always sort of initially, but I think as they sort of went on and became more prominent, I think it was very easy to sort of any opponents to sort of say, well, you know, preservationism equals, you know, you just want to sort of keep the countryside as a museum almost, and sort of you know, keep it as it was, rather than this sort of evolving worked landscape. And they worked, I think, quite hard to essentially say otherwise, that actually, you know, and I think in everything they did and in their actions and in their sort of publications, it was very much the opposite. But this word, I think, just, if you can come back to that and sort of keep saying, well, you know, preservationism. So they did change to the Council for the Protection of Rural England, I think in the 60s. And then the council part got dropped, and that changed to campaign. So they've always kept CPRE, obviously. So it's sort of, they've just toyed with these ideas. I think probably council perhaps had sort of, again, some baggage with that. And I think, you know, sorry, I think campaign as well. I think that's perhaps, you could sort of see a departure from, you know, sort of an umbrella group, a collection of societies, and a sort of certain style perhaps of approaching preservationism. Campaign, you know, you, like you said, you're edging more towards being a pressure group, being a sort of lobbying essentially, and perhaps this more modern idea that we have of the CPRE. So it's interesting as well, you know, the sort of how this language does shift, and how that kind of colors our view of the organization, and not only its organization, but how it works, its priorities, its motivations. So it's fascinating. And you're saying about sort of amenity, that, you know, this idea of perhaps that has sort of certain baggage as well. And it's fascinating. You think, well, just the word amenity, should it really have that much power? And yet actually looking at you know, what the CPRE, the early CPRE meant by that. You know, it was this really broad and sort of quite powerful word that was almost this sort of intuitive idea of living in and being in the countryside, and it was for everyone. You know, it was this idea that you know, no matter who you were or where you lived, amenity was important, and it was the thing that you should have, not just have access to as in it's over there and I've got a nice view from my house, but a thing you inhabit, you live it in your daily life. It's this sort of it's how you are, how you react with, you know, the landscape, this relational. So it was quite important. And I think, I don't know, perhaps with sort of it being used more and more in sort of planning terms, I wonder whether that has had some sort of you know, I don't know, some sort of effect on it, perhaps. I don't know. And how it's, I mean, that would be really interesting just to see how, you know, from you know, with the Planning Act in 1948, you know, how then amenity was sort of changed perhaps, or how it was kind of taken up then and how it's sort of developed since then. So my research finished in the 1950s, and sort of just that sort of slight, so started to see that slight change with, you know, the 1948 Planning Act, and you could see sort of elements of that. But yeah, I think there's certainly a lot more work to be done on this. And yeah, sorry, that was a slightly long answer to it, but yeah, I think that the power of words certainly, and the way that people see the CPRE and their name changes, I think, reflect that a little bit, and how they're sort of been trying to get away from certain ideas, I think, as well.
Well done, Francesca. Thank you. That was very interesting. Annabelle, I'm not ignoring your questions, but I wondered if it would be appropriate to go straight to Stefan at this moment, as we were talking about amenity and words. And Stefan, you say, I was interested to hear about the initial support from Neville Chamberlain as Minister of Health, and wonder whether the health benefits of access to the countryside figured in the CPRE's early years.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yes, I think to an extent. I think not necessarily in the way that we might nowadays sort of think about health and the countryside. Perhaps nowadays it's more about, well, a mixture of physical and mental health, I suppose, and it's we sort of talk about it a lot more openly, I think, in that sense. But certainly there were ideas about you know, escaping, the ideas about escaping the city, weren't there, at this time? And that actually the city was not necessarily a very healthy place to be at times. You know, you had this sort of smoke abatement society and things like that, and the CPRE, I think, were they? I think they're either an affiliate or a constituent society. It might have been affiliated, but they certainly talked about smoke and smog and things like that. And actually, I think whilst they do predominantly sort of talk about the countryside and towns, they do kind of talk a little bit about urban life as well, and yeah, the sort of I don't know how to sort of put it, because they don't sort of talk about it in a kind of, oh, you know, like how we might identify as mental health, but the sort of idea that you want to live somewhere pleasant, that means something to you, that you take care of. And I was just thinking about a pamphlet that the Lancashire branch actually wrote. Phil Barnes essentially put it together, and he did all the maps and most of the photographs. And they talk about sort of urban areas where they're sort of full of you know, posters and advertisements and billboards and all this sort of stuff, and sort of saying, well, you know, I mean, it's sort of language of the time and things, but they're saying, well, you know, housewives, they sort of you know, they scrub their doorsteps and they are proud of their homes, and they want to have beauty in their life, and why are they less deserving of that than someone who might be able to afford to live in a nice fancy area with a wonderful view and a large garden, etc., etc. So this idea that, you know, amenity was for everyone, it was to make everyone's life better, it was to have this idea of beauty and character and order and a certain pleasantness, I think, and for that, for the individual, not just because it was this sort of wonderful sort of philosophical ideal, although they do love a bit of philosophy, but this idea that it had real effects on people's day-to-day lives. And I think we might now label that, I think, in a different way, but you know, we might talk about the mental health aspect of that, but I think they didn't have that language perhaps in that same way, but certainly those ideas were there about your lifestyle and your life. And yeah, hopefully that's answers it. Sorry.
Thank you for that absolutely fascinating response, Francesca. Annabelle, I really am not ignoring you. You wrote, has Griffin's approach influenced your own approach to thorny issues with people?
Wow. Oh, I like that question. Oh, I wish. No, I think I'm a bit hot-headed. I don't know. No, I think it's fascinating. I think I do like how you sort of see him with a lot of these sort of arguments, you know, like I said with the RBA and with Barnes, and he was sort of, you know, and there are a few times when Barnes sort of gets ahead of himself a little bit, should we say, and kind of runs off with this idea or with something, and either, you know, Griffin has to sort of pull him back in a little bit, or sometimes, you know, the national Cpre would say, well, that's for the Lancashire branch to, you know, that's how they view things. It's not necessarily how we do things, and they to distance themselves slightly. So yeah, it's interesting in his sort of approach. And yeah, I mean, I sort of talk for hours about sort of this idea of amenity of approach and this sort of politeness and its various sort of influences. But yeah, I'm not sure. Perhaps the patience of sitting in an archive. Perhaps I think there's definitely has to be a bit of quiet, calm patience for that. So maybe in that way.
Brilliant, thanks. Annabelle, I'm going to make you ask your next question.
Oh, no, don't worry.
I shall read it anyway. Well, you put it there. Everybody's read it already, probably. So Annabelle says, do we need to ask Virginia if she is a member of the CPRE then to campaign and have a voice and make a difference? And I presume you're saying, Annabelle, that maybe the LI doesn't offer that. Have I interpreted that correctly?
Oh, yes.
Virginia, would you care to respond?
No, I'm very happy to be a member of both. I think they should be complementary. I mean, I think things are different these days. We need to work together to deal with climate change. Things like the kind of changes that farming practices are going to bring to the landscape, the kind of changes that managing floods to the landscape are going to bring, all the kind of infrastructure for energy. I don't think either organisation can manage to do this on its own, frankly.
Well spoken, Virginia.
Yes, 100%. I would agree with that. I think there's a huge amount to be said for that, and
maybe
yeah.
we have to think more carefully or a little bit more creatively on our ideas of beauty, but that's another subject.
Yes, I was tempted to venture into the ideas of order, but I won't. Stefan, do you want to unmute and ask your question, or would you like me to read it?
No, you should be able to hear me, I hope.
Yes, you're fine.
It was more a comment about Amenity, which, as a number of people have said, I think it has all sorts of different meanings through time and through context. And one of the things that's always particularly bugged me is coming across signs for civic amenity sites when they really mean a recycling centre or something like that. But yeah, and it does seem to have, to my mind, a different meaning in planning terms to certain other contexts. But yeah, it's just so hard to put a real finger on it. But thanks for a fascinating evening anyway.
Thank you for your comment.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I actually quite agree with that, because you wouldn't believe the times when you're searching for, you know, an article to sort of site and you're thinking, right, I'm going to look for amenity, and suddenly it pops up and it's to do with services and facilities and things like that. So I mean, you know, they are linked. There is a sort of, you know, I can see why that word is used, but definitely irritating from a research sort of point of view when you're trying to find the right article. But yes, I think yeah, the concept is, I mean, you were sort of saying, you know, it's difficult to sort of pin down. I think the CPRE themselves didn't very often sort of pin the concept down, and there are a few attempts at, you know, sort of definition of amenity, but more or less you see it through how they talk about the landscape in a kind of broader sense, and through their actions, and that's the thing that sort of tells you about amenity. Not necessarily this, well, they say, well, right, we're going to define amenity in this sort of certain way. And I think it would be fascinating to see, you know, how other organizations have done, you know, perhaps in a similar way, that perhaps they haven't themselves also defined amenity, but they use it in certain ways. And or if there's a word they have, you know, sort of, what's the word, you know, used instead, I think, you know, that sort of thing. So it would be fascinating to see how this idea, you know, sort of has been taken up by other organizations as well. So yeah, sorry.
Well, thank you, Francesca. And looking at the time, I think perhaps I will pass on Camilla's thanks, which I think echoes us all our thoughts. Thank you, Francesca. That was fascinating, and I think we all found that. Annabelle, can I pass back to you so Francesca can go and get a hot toddy and perhaps lie down and darken from recuperate?
Absolutely, Francesca, that was fantastic. I think you've opened the door for us on an organisation and understanding. I think that we need to know more now, so we're going to have to pull you back in for more chats and things. I think it's been really interesting. I think all the crossovers and of ideas and people and things. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Well done.
Thank you very much for having me this evening. It's been lovely to sort of, you know, have a captive audience to talk about the Cpre for once. It's quite nice.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. We're really grateful. So if everybody'd like to unmute, then we can give you a little clap.
Oh. Thank you.